Now, I'm going to take you on a virtual walk between Furness Vale and Buxworth. Dolly Lane. It's an ancient route between New Mills and Buxworth. It wasn't linked to Furness Vale until building of the Turnpike Road and the bridge over the Goyt in the early 1830s. We'll start at the bottom of Station Road in Furness Vale, and as we cross the bridge, we pass over the River Goyt, the original boundary between Cheshire and Derbyshire. On the right you can see a change in the masonry of the bridge parapet, and this is where the toll cottage once stood. The bridge is known as Gowhole Bridge, or sometimes Jolly Bridge, and this was part of the Thornset Turnpike. The turnpikes were abolished by the Local Government Act of 1888, to much local rejoicing. People didn't like paying the tolls. The picture on the screen is a digital reconstruction of how the bridge and the turnpike, the toll cottage, might have looked. This was a sort of fairly standard design of toll cottages and similar to other cottages that this particular turnpike used. The name of this little hamlet of Gowhole was recorded in 1587 as Gowhole, the earliest record. Various other spellings are subsequently found, no doubt as the name became corrupted. Jollyhole, Jollyhole, Gowhole, and finally Gowhole, and as we have seen, Jowl in reference to the bridge. It's speculated that the name's a corruption of Jodrell, the family who owns a lot of the land around Furness Vale. Just around the corner, on the left-hand side of Marsh Lane, is the builder's yard of Nick Rowley, which we can see in the photograph here. This was once the coal wharf for Lady Pit Colliery. A tunnel was dug in 1853 from the mine, emerging in this yard, with a tramway that opened out here into a number of sidings. The coal would then be loaded onto carts to be transported away. The tunnel was also used by miners as a shortcut to work. After the mine was abandoned in 1903, the tunnel was used by New Mills Waterworks to carry a water main. I think it may still do. And this is a view inside the tunnel when there were still tracks. The coal mining business of Levi and Elijah Haugh played an important role in the industry of this area. Joseph Haugh, born in 1777, obtained mineral leases on Waterside Moor and was soon to become a coal master. He died in 1843 and left his coal business to his three sons, Levi, Amos and Elijah. Amos didn't take any further part in the running of the business, but Levi and Elijah, forming a partnership called L&E Hall Brothers, embarked on a considerable expansion. Their interests included Lady Pit, Barn Pit, also known as Dolly Pit, Shallcross Mine, Wharf Pit in Whaley Bridge, Bank End, and for a while Furness Colliery, as well as mines further afield. It was low-grade coal, and much of the output was sold to fire the furnaces at Buxworth. Levi and Elijah built a new home, Moorland House, which stands on the hillside above Birch Vale. Levi, a lifelong bachelor, and Elijah, with his young family, were soon to move in. Large families were common at that time, but it was unusual that Elijah and Mary's 10 children, born between 1832 and 1853, all survived to adulthood. What was also unusual was that all but one were girls. 3 of these daughters remained unmarried and became known as the spinsters of Moorland House. They all took an interest in the business and, having received an inheritance from their grandfather Joseph, invested their money in coal. The success of the business is evident from the fact that by the time of the deaths of the three spinsters, each had amassed a wealth of over £11,000, a not inconsiderable sum in those days. Elijah died at Morland House in 1866, and Levi in 1872. And the management of the business passed to Elijah's only son, Levi Joseph Haugh. He was only 17 at the time, and the business was managed by trustees until his coming of age in 1880. By this time, the coal seams were beginning to be worked out, and better quality coal was coming over the Pennines from South Yorkshire. Demand from the lime kilns at Buxworth was diminishing. Lady Pit closed in 1903. The reserves were becoming diminished, and it was becoming harder to keep the water out of the mine. So the business was sold up, and the assets distributed. This photograph shows three local businessmen. On the left is John Nowell. He was a stationer and the postmaster at Whaley Bridge. This is Levi Hall, and this is Elijah Bridge, who was farmed at Gowhole Farm. You'll hear several references to the name Drinkwater. Whilst the Jodrells owned much of the land to the west of the River Goyt, the Drinkwaters were the largest landowners on the eastern side of the valley, owning property from Chinley to Disley. We'll now turn on to Lady Pit Road. Just before we pass under the railway bridge, notice the grazing land on the right-hand side, at the side of the two houses. Here was Furness Vale Tennis Club. The land was laid out with courts and included a small wooden building, probably to house equipment, or maybe to change in. When the municipal courts were opened in Furness Village, these reverted to farming land. In the picture, we can see two of the Wild sisters who famously owned a wool shop in Furness Vale for many, many years. And in the middle is their uncle, Luke Carter. He lived on Dolly Lane in Furness Vale. And we can see some railway wagons on the siding above. Look for a warning sign on the bridge. This reveals that an earlier name for the road was Coal Pit Lane. Dolly Lane begins at the following T-junction. The track to the left leads to farms, and the path continues uphill to eventually join Laneside Road. This photograph is from about 1960, and it shows the remains of the Beard and Bugsworth Colliery. The buildings are here. It was also known as Lady Pit more commonly. Just beyond the ruins, we can see the colliery spoil tips. Alan Chorlton, who lives in Furness Vale, remembers when these were home to hundreds of rabbits. Out of view to the left is evidence of an embankment that carried a railway siding from Gowhole and enabled coal to be dispatched from the mine. There was a period, I think in the 1960s, after the Gowhole sidings had closed, when this area, just to the left here, was used for whippet racing. A tall brick chimney once stood here, just about where this arrow is. There was a storm one night in 1949, and it was struck by a thunderbolt, and the materials were scattered up to 300 metres away. There's a large round structure opposite that still stands, and this had been a ventilation shaft for the mine. On the opposite side of Lady Pit is a building which may have been connected with the colliery, but this is uncertain. It has more recently been known as a sausage factory. Here traditional sausage skins were made using natural animal products. It's now a private house. Behind the building were some stables. These were used by Gowhole Farm when it was a stud farm, breeding racehorses. For a while, the stud farm was owned by Manchester University. And ones who famous racehorses won a lot of races. One was called Furness Vale Astonishment. Back on Dolly Lane, as you head towards Buxworth, look over the wall on the right-hand side as the road starts to climb uphill. And you can still see evidence of the turntable pit from the Gowhole sidings. There's nothing left apart from the sort of circular depression in the land. It's been cleared recently, so it's very easy to see. Gowhole was an extensive railway yard on the eastern side of the valley. It had been constructed in 1903 as an extension to Hall's sidings, which had served Lady Pit. Despite the rural location, it was strategically placed between junctions at New Mills and Chinley, which offered direct routes to Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, Derby and London. In this photograph, a passenger train heads south on the slow lines, passing the signal box, which we can see here. The upsidings on the left comprise 10 parallel tracks, as well as the extension to Lady Pit Colliery. And beyond this train were a further 13 sidings, and then the fast lines between New Mills and Chinley. Dolly Lane climbs uphill on the left-hand side, past Brown Meadow Farm and hillside cottages towards Buxworth. And in the distance, you can just make out the footbridge which crossed over the sidings. The railway yard had been an extremely busy place. In the summer of 1953, for instance, more than 70 goods trains were scheduled to arrive and depart each day. Gowhole was in operation throughout the night, but it finally closed in 1969 and was dismantled the following year. This photograph shows the sidings overlooked by Brown Meadow Farm. And this is Hillside Cottage, and Dolly Lane runs behind that wall. In this photograph we get a better view of the footbridges. A footpath ran down here. It still exists actually, but of course the bridges have gone since. And after crossing the tracks here, it descended and ran through a short tunnel underneath the main line. The bridge was known as Shirts Bridge. Many of the goods trains carried coal, often piled high on open trucks. Inevitably, some spilled out, especially when the trucks were being shunted. Some people thought that coal picking was fair game, but not the police. In 1926, Mr. Littlewood, a calico machine printer, admitted to magistrates to taking 140 pounds of coal from a heap at Gowhole at 6 a.m. That's why he did not take it in daytime. He replied, "Well, that would not be legal. I thought it was a refuse tip. People have taken coal away in all sorts of vehicles, from a bassinet to a motor car. If you don't pick coal when there's a strike on, people say you're too lazy to do it." He was fined 15 shillings. And Edward Higgins, a shunter, denied stealing 300 weight of coal, despite the police having caught him tying 3 bags. He was fined 15 shillings. But the magistrates, sympathising with his struggle to survive the general strike, tried to ensure that he would not lose his job. Round Meadow Farm is the first building on the right-hand side of Dolly Lane. The house is believed to date from 1750, although it was rebuilt in 1868. The barn appears to have been extended at various times since. And the water supply came from a well on the lane. In 1892, a farmer's son, Norman Ashton, was crossing the nearby Midland Railway to fetch a load of hay. He was struck by a passing express train and dragged for 12 yards before being thrown clear. He sustained serious injuries to his head and face, and his arm was broken. The cart was reduced to matchwood, but the horse was unharmed. Sadly, Norman died 5 days later. And in 1957, Mrs. Bowden, who lived at the farm then, went out to feed her hens. She was pecked in the leg by a cockerel. She suffered from varicose veins, and despite help from the railway workers at Gowhole sidings, whom she called for help, the flow of blood could not be stemmed. She was taken to Stockport Infirmary, but died from loss of blood. Yeah. Not many people have been killed by a cockerel. Hillcroft is opposite Round Meadow. It's now one large house, but it was originally 2 small farm workers' cottages, known as Springbank and Broadhurst. They were converted and extended by Mr. and Mrs. Marcroft, who had brought them to live there. And a short way farther down Dolly Lane, on the right-hand side, is Big Tree Farm. The left-hand side window on the elevation facing the valley bears an inscription on the lintel, rebuilt in 1868, T&E Drinkwater. And at the side of the house, a footpath leads downhill, and set into the wall are a number of pigeonholes. These are unusual, being less than 2 metres above ground level, and some have protruding stones for the birds to rest on before entering. They would have been easy to catch at this height, and were a common item on the menu in past times. There were 2 Drinkwater brothers, and according to local legend, one of them hanged himself from a big tree at the farm. This left a mystery, as he had over £300 in his hip pocket, and no one knew why he should have done such a thing. Could it have been from then that the farm became known as Big Tree? Just before Dolly Lane makes a sharp left turn is Lower House Farm, set back up a drive on the left. This had originally been 2 properties, known as Greenhead cottages. During alterations, it was found that an extension had previously been built, and beneath the roof was the original tiling. The earlier roof had never been removed. We'll just take a right turn now and head down to Waterside. After passing under the railway bridges, there are low parapets on the side of the road. This was a bridge under which a railway branch was intended to pass on its way to Whaley Bridge. The work was abandoned once it had reached this point. Despite its proximity to Furness Vale, the hamlet of Waterside was historically isolated on the eastern side of the River Goyt. Until the development of turnpike roads in the early 18th century, there were no river crossings between Whaley Bridge and New Mills. Marsh Lane and Dolly Lane was an ancient route between New Mills and Buxworth. From Greenhead, a track led eastwards to Waterside, the only access to this hamlet. A footbridge across the river appears on maps published after the mid-19th century. The footpath leads to Buxton Road near the quarry in Furness Vale. It was probably established sometime after opening the new turnpike road in 1804. There is, however, mention of a bridge in the mortgage of 1744, so it might predate this. The first record of Waterside is dated 1612, when a property there was sold by John Pott of Staincliffe to Edward Bennett of Buxworth. On his death, the property passed to his second son, William. William died in 1765, and according to his will of 1706, Waterside passed to his son-in-law, Thomas Heskey, and on his death, to his wife Ellen, William Bennett's daughter. The property was next divided between Ellen's daughters, Elizabeth Goddard and Mary Bennett. Even the dwelling house was split into 2. The tide apportionments of 1841 give details of each numbered plot, including ownership and occupancy. At this time, Waterside Cottage was owned by John Drinkwater and occupied by Mary Marriott, presumably his tenant. The adjacent cottages were owned by Charles Hobson and occupied by 7 different families. The lands that comprised the old Waterside estate had by this time been divided into 6 different ownerships. Peathill's farm was owned by James Braddock and occupied by James Bennett. Waterside cottages comprises of 2 parts. The earliest dates from the 17th century, and the later, taller section is from the 19th century. Combined, it's a Grade 2 listed building. Not far away is Peathill's farm. It was built in the late 18th century as a farmhouse and barn under the same roof. Until about 10 years ago, there was neither a road nor farm track. Access was solely by a rough footpath to the front door. It has now been extensively modernised, but retains its original appearance. The census returns show that between 1841 and 1911, as many as 20 people lived at Waterside and Peathills. Surprisingly few families stayed for more than 10 years, as successive surveys show mostly new residents every decade. The census tells us a little about the residents of Waterside. Charles Hobson, who we have already heard of, was living at the hamlet in 1841. His occupation was that of a tea dealer. At the same time, his neighbour from Peathills, 12-year-old James Bennett, was already working in the coal mines. Hobson's daughter, Sarah, continues to live at Waterside, for her name appears in the next 3 censuses. Mining was the most common occupation, probably due to the proximity of Lady Pit, just a kilometre away across the meadows. 10 years later, we find that Sarah Yarwood, aged 13, was already weaving cotton, a job that she was still doing 10 years later. And in 1871, we find John Gould at Peathill's farm, working as a labourer at Chris Quarry. It was quite a long walk before starting a day's hard work for a boy who was just 10 years old. The same census shows that William Morton lived alone at Waterside. He was still earning his living as a dry stone waller at the age of 78. And in 1901, 15-year-old Ethel Cribb was still going to school, not as a pupil, but as a member of staff. The latest census to be made public is that of 1921. Then Leonard Redfern, aged 29, was living at Waterside. He was a coal miner and had a fair distance to travel to work at Arden Quarry in Birch Vale. This was the last mine to be worked in the New Mills area. It was abandoned in June 1925 after a tram runner lost his life in December 1924 following a shale burst. It does not appear to have been Mr. Redfern though. William Spencer, a signalman at Gowhole sidings, had family visitors at the time of this census. His brother-in-law from Birmingham worked as a pearl button maker. We will return to Dolly Lane, and bisected by the corner of the road is Greenhead Farm, a converted barn being on the left-hand side. It has its origins in the early 17th century, when the location was known as Buxworth Green, spelt Greene. The property was originally much larger and included a number of cottages within its boundaries. The Furness Vale History Society archives record that wives of farm workers, when pregnant, came here to give birth, the west wing of the house being put to their use. The house possessed a cradle that had been handed down through previous owners. It was once a Derbyshire custom that when a house was built, a wooden cradle was also made. The cradle was supposed to remain in the house forever. To take it away would bring bad luck. Another legend is that if the farmer's wife did not want a family, she would keep the cradle in the bedroom. It would only be taken to another room if she wanted to become pregnant. In 1812, farmer John Drinkwater's wife answered a knocking at the door at midnight. She answered, thinking that she was being called out to her midwifery duties. She was faced so by a gang of ruffians who demanded £100 from her. Answering that there was very little in the house, she said that they might take what there was. The gang rushed in, their faces disguised, and proceeded to ransack the property. They took £20 in cash, 10 cheeses, enough bedding for 6 beds, all of her husband and children's clothing. They drank the ale and spirits in the cellar and trampled over butter, cream and other provisions. All this time, one of the gang stood over the husband's bed, threatening his life with a sword. John Drinkwater dared not stir, for beneath his bed was his life savings of £200 and the deeds of the property. The gang of 16 men left after stealing and damaging property to the value of £150. Following the event, a detachment of the Royal Horse Guards marched from Derby, intent on capturing the offenders. Some 15 men were arrested at New Mills and stood trial at Derby. All but 3 were acquitted, as the witnesses' accounts were suspect. The remaining 3 were sentenced to death, despite claiming their innocence. Having been hanged at Derby in April 1813, the body of Paul Mason, aged 33, was returned to New Mills. Upon examination, his body was found still to be warm, but a gurgling sound was heard from his throat. He was clearly still alive, and might have been saved had an attempt been made to resuscitate him. Climbing the steep hill, we next reach Barn Cottage on the right, and opposite, a track leads to both the Hough and to Clough Head Farm, dividing after about 200 metres. The road here was once known as Barn Level. The Hough is an extensive and ancient farm. The earliest record is from 1381, when it was known as Haugh. It has since gone by other names. In 1569, spelt Hauge. In 1601, Haghe. And in 1611, Hagh. The old farmhouse dates from 1640, and the barns are from the 17th and 18th century. It was here that a large stone head was unearthed during renovations, its age unknown. Mr. Bradbury of Furness Vale said that this was one of the last places where Druid worship and sacrifice took place. He doesn't tell us what was sacrificed though. Clough Head farmhouse dates from 1842, although the farm may be much older. A large modern barn doubles as an arena each summer, when Clough Head is home of a weekend music festival. Around the farm is a collection of industrial and trade implements. Clough Head was once the location of a small coal pit, originally known as Mr. Drinkwater's engine pit. The mine seems to have been worked from about 1800, but it's not clear when these workings were abandoned. A tramway operated until at least 1820, and it appears on the 1840 Ordnance Survey map, and may still have been operational at that date. It followed the route of the present-day farm track between Clough Head and Dolly Lane, where it crossed the road at the side of Barn Cottage, before heading across the fields towards the lime kilns at Buxworth. After a short distance, it was joined by a similar tramway from Dolly Pit. Back on Dolly Lane, and after 100 metres or so, a driveway on the left leads to an unusual-looking house with a tall tower. This was the site of Dolly Pit, or Barn Pit. The Barn Pit, its original name, was first worked at about 1850, and they had been named after the Barn Cottage nearby. The first shaft was worked by horse gin, but it was soon abandoned because the coal was of poor quality. This was replaced by a second shaft that reached a lower seam of much better quality coal. The engine house still stands and was incorporated into a private residence. The engine man had been Thomas Hadfield, a Buxton man who founded Brierley Green Congregational Chapel. A tramway was installed sometime after 1850 and probably continued working until the mine closure. It crossed Dolly Lane and ran downhill towards the lime kilns at Buxworth, joining the route of the earlier tramway from Clough Head Pit. Dolly Pit was owned by Levi and Elijah Haugh, who announced its closure in 1889. The pit was no longer able to cope with the amount of water draining into the workings. The coal would in future be cut from Lady Pit, which was now connected underground. The engine house remained derelict until in 1975 the local council proposed its demolition. It was saved after the intervention of Keith Alford and Gerald Haythornthwaite, and the following year converted into a modern home. Alfred Goddard was told by his father, who had lived at Ancoats, that at the time that Dolly Pit was worked, the lane was a rutted old road with carts travelling to and from the Buxworth limecones. The council would come along now and again with loads of lump limestone. This was tipped at the roadside and broken up with a whip hammer by men who were unemployed, or those who wished to earn a little extra money. It's probable that the road takes its name from Dolly Pit, the small colliery near Ancoats farm. Alfred Goddard of Buxworth, writing in the local press some years ago, told the story of a young woman called Dorothy, or Dolly, who, through an ill-fated love affair with one of the mine workers, committed suicide by jumping down the mine shaft. From that day, the mine was known as Dolly Pit. It's a romantic tale and might just be true. In the early 18th century, Dolly Lane was known as Ancoats, Brierley Lane, or Oliver Lane. After another 300 metres, we reach Ancoats Farm. This is an interesting group of old farm buildings, which have since been divided up into 3 separate cottages. Opposite Ancoats, a road climbs uphill towards Laneside Farm, where there was yet another coal working, John Oliver's coal pit. The mine shaft was in the field, across the road from Laneside Farmhouse, a much altered group of buildings which date from 1629. The name of Ancoats in Manchester possibly derives from the Old English Ancoats, meaning lonely cottages, and it would seem appropriate if this farm's name had the same origin. There was in 14th century Lancashire a landowner, Henry D. Ancoats, so there's another possible source. After Ancoats, the road descends downhill towards Buxworth. Just before we reach the end of Dolly Lane at Brierley Green, we pass Merrill's Wood on the right. This was the location for Buxworth Colliery, which was worked between approximately 1811 and 1899. Where the woodland comes to an end was an adit and an air shaft, and hidden between the trees was a further adit and air shaft. The underground workings extended almost as far north as Ancoats Farm. And this last photograph shows the end of Dolly Lane where it comes to the T-junction at Brierley Green. This map from about 1776 shows the road network in Derbyshire, east of the River Goyt, and we can trace the route of Dolly Lane and Marsh Lane running between New Mills and Buxworth.